Sweden's empire is coming back. Hello, welcome to Dangerous Policy, a channel aimed at intelligent people wanting to discuss important issues facing life and society. My name is Crispin, and today I want to talk about the resurgence of Sweden's defence expenditure. It has been enormous. The story has just broken that in the next 4 years, the Swedish government will boost its defence spending by 40%. That is on top of something like 85% increase over the past 6 years. So in 10 years, Sweden's defence budget is going to more than double, right? It's extraordinary resurgence in military spending, increasing rearmament of their state. And one must ask, why? Well, once upon a time, Sweden was a militarist power, right? Hard to imagine now. But Sweden has a long tradition of imperial war with Gustav Adolphus, the 30 Years' War, Charles XII of Sweden invading Russia, and the whole saga with Peter the Great. Sweden was one of those players. And now it's sort of seen as this global mediator, peace-loving country, conciliatory between different disputes and states, a progenitor of so-called, in my opinion, non-existent soft power, and therefore sort of kind of warm and fuzzy. And yet now they're emerging again as a militarist state. Why is this happening? Well, during the Cold War, the border in NATO was very fixed between West and East Germany. As Winston Churchill famously said, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that curtain rested these communist-controlled occupations of Central and Eastern Europe versus the democratic West, of which Sweden was a neutral player, off there in the top corner, kind of out of the way, not where the direct lines of sight were between the two countries, and officially neutral, right? So, and that's what they had to be for so long because they couldn't afford to incur the ire of either country, particularly the Soviet Union, given its proximity. And that from that emerged a new diplomacy, a new foreign policy structure that led it to that sort of peace and conciliatory, mediatory relationship that it has today. It didn't happen naturally. It happened as a result of geopolitical forces. When the Cold War ended, Germany was unified in NATO. And to the dismay of the Russians who thought they had a deal, NATO has continued to expand eastward, and now it has reached right up to the Russian border on the eastern border of Estonia, about 150 kilometers from St. Petersburg. That has completely changed the tectonic plates of global alliances, so that a military alliance, the frontier, is right next to Sweden. So Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they are all right up there where Russia feels most threatened and where a flashpoint in that region between NATO and Russia is most likely to occur. Sweden cannot afford to ignore this because in the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and even Poland, the land is extraordinarily flat. It is very hard to project power from Western Europe that far east. It's a place where 3 invasions of Russia have taken place. So the Russians feel very threatened. They were invaded by, obviously, the Wehrmacht with the terrible destruction of World War II. They were invaded there by Napoleon, and they were also, in fact, invaded there by Sweden. So it's a tinderbox area where the Baltic states feel incredibly threatened that Russia may just invade and take them over. Russia feels very threatened because it has NATO right on its border through a very vulnerable channel. And therefore, Sweden is a critical player. The only way to defend the Baltic states from an invasion from Russia, given how small this territory is, we're looking at like 400 or 500 kilometers to the Baltic Sea, very flat terrain. The only way to defend the Baltic is to control Swedish airspace. It relies on 24-hour American sorties coming from Swedish air bases. Everybody knows that. So the war plans as they are currently declassified state that if there is an invasion from the east, there'll be what's called a rapid response force that's deployed to meet them as more of like a screen, not a defense in depth, to try and slow the advance of Russian forces to allow a more vigorous mobilization and response. In order to make that screen effective, there needs to be frequent air support contesting the airspace to prevent Russian air superiority and striking back against Russian invading forces. The only way to do that with fuel and munitions is to do that from Sweden. There is no way to do that from any other place that is going to be effective. So since both sides know that, Russian plans involve the destruction of all Swedish air bases. This means that Sweden can't be neutral, even if it wanted to be. It could be neutral during the Cold War because the front line was south between West and East Germany. Any conflict would be between those two. But since the Baltic states are now the threshold, Sweden can't be a neutral country, even though they might prefer to be. So although they are not a member of NATO, they are a member in NATO in all but name. They have no choice, okay? And because they're not a member of NATO, they can't necessarily rely wholeheartedly on all the other NATO countries coming to their aid. At least ostensibly under the NATO Charter, an attack on one is an attack on all. You can be very skeptical about the willingness of the Spaniards to die for the Latvians, right? But for Sweden, it's a non-starter. This has to happen. They've been rearming Gotland Island, that island that sits between Sweden and the Baltic states, and they are militarizing to try and prevent the destruction of their air bases in the event of conflict, and also to preserve deterrence, because if Russia doesn't feel like it can prevent sorties from Sweden, they're going to be less likely to invade the Baltic states in the first place, thereby preserving stability and peace. That is at least the theory. It's also a lot of indications in terms of Russia's force structure development that they're willing to put teeth behind it. In 2013, the US government for the first time openly accused Russia of violating what's called the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. That's a treaty between the United States and Russia that was signed in the closing stages of the Cold War, to denuclearize the battlefield in Europe, right? What that effectively does is it prevents missiles of certain ranges from being deployed by either the United States or Russia. Now, Russia started violating this treaty, not because they wanted to create new nuclear weapons, in my opinion, but to create conventional missiles within that violation range that could be launched from Russia directly at Swedish airfields, okay? i.e. that Russia would mass produce conventional ballistic missiles and Tomahawk-style cruise missiles, in the Russian variants Iskander missiles, to destroy and disrupt Swedish airfields. Knowing this, Sweden has had to respond, right? Because Russia is deliberately making weapons specifically targeted at Swedish contingencies. Now, the United States has since withdrawn from the treaty, accusing Russia of continuous violations. That is fairly accurate, and INF was a dead letter anyway, because America has to think about China, America has to think about other countries, despite the fact that no other country was party to this treaty. So it means that the challenge with China had already begun with America tied with one arm behind its back because it couldn't field certain missiles that are critical for Chinese contingencies. So it's a good thing for the United States to withdraw from the treaty. It's a good thing for Russia to withdraw from the treaty because they were thinking about Sweden. My main concern on that front is that it's holding up other arms control negotiations because now neither side trusts one another, but that's another story. So Sweden has remilitarized. What does that mean for Sweden going forward? Well, Sweden will certainly start to lose that air of impartiality and neutrality that it has fostered for so long. It will no longer be perceived in future years as sort of meek little friendly country in the Nordic region where everyone's sort of peace and love. We will start to see a hardening of their foreign policy. They will certainly integrate themselves more into the military exercises that happen in Lithuania. So the kind of partnership that exists between Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, that will start to include Sweden. It must. The United States will be very grateful to Sweden for increasing it, and using Sweden as an example to shame Germany and France, who are still a joke when it comes to their defence spending. So it's a really good thing for deterrence. It's a really good thing for Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And I think also signals a shift in the nature of NATO itself, because it's clear that the NATO is not unified when it comes to defending the eastern borders. As I've said before, you can divide NATO into two categories. Those Western European countries that were primarily concerned about invasion from the Soviet Union. Now that the Soviet Union no longer exists, they see NATO as basically a security promotion vehicle, counterterrorism, deployments in Afghanistan, that sort of thing, but not really to deal with Russia at all. They see Russia as part of the European family, and therefore they're not worried about invasion. Well, that is definitely not the case for the former occupied countries in Central and Eastern Europe. Poland, the Baltic states, they definitely are part of NATO wholly and exclusively because of their fear of Russia. Russia's bellicosity towards the Baltic states has not been promising, particularly when it comes to things like Belarus. I'm sure the Swedish security planners have thought, look, the destabilization in Belarus means that the probability of military contingencies involving their immediate near neighborhood are much more likely in the coming years. So Belarus is a big catalyst for this decision, I think, for Sweden. And therefore, they need to remilitarize to deter any attack on the Baltic states, and to demonstrate that they can defend their airfields and that they will be willing to provide those airfields to American military forces in the event of war. That will hopefully stabilize the situation somewhat and lead to peace, but it will also change the character of the Swedish government and the Swedish way of looking at the world. Military arsenals tend to do that. So if you find any value in this conversation, please do like and subscribe. I definitely cover Baltic issues quite regularly, as most of you will know. Leave a comment down below. I'll definitely address them in the week in review. And as developments occur with the Swedish military expansion, we'll follow that in the future. Thank you.